This question belongs to data structure subject and the topic name is hashing. It was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states a hash table with 10 buckets. So we are given a hash table with 10 buckets with one slot per bucket. So we can just have one slot per bucket. And 10 bucket means indexing will be from 0 to 9. If we have n buckets, then indexing will be from 0 to n minus 1. Then it says is shown in the following figure. This is the hash table. The symbols S1 to S7 initially are entered using a hash function with linear probing. So we are entering the symbol S1 to S7 using a hash function. We do not know the hash function, we just know the output. The maximum number of comparisons needed in searching an item that is not present is. Now suppose we want to search an item. Let us suppose we want to search S8. So it's asking what is the worst case comparison that can occur for searching S8 in this hash table using linear probing. The options are 4, 5, 6 and 3. So what is linear probing is, suppose we will get the key S8, we will apply hash function on this and then we will get some output. Let us suppose Sx dash, not Sx dash, we will get an output, let us suppose X. X means X is the slot where this item should come. And if that X slot is empty, then the item would be present over there. And if it is not empty, if it is empty, then put S8 at X. Else, what it will do? It will do X plus plus. It will check at the next slot. If it is not empty, then it will check at the next slot. It will look like this. If it is not empty, then it will do X plus plus. It will check the next slot. If it is empty, it will put S8 over there. Else, it will again do X plus plus till we will find an empty slot. So what will be the worst case comparisons? So in these questions, the worst case comparison has a formula. Worst case comparison is equals to cardinality or the size of maximum cluster plus 1. Because I will tell you how this comes. Let us suppose we want to put an item over here. If we want to put at 2, it will come at 2. So we have to find the maximum cluster so that we can do maximum comparison. If we want to put at 3, then 3 is vacant, so 1 comparison. 3 is occupied, so 1 comparison. Then we check at the next slot using the linear probing. So 4. We will check at 4, so number of comparison is 1 plus 1. It is also occupied, so we will check at the next slot. Here it's empty, but still one comparison would be there, as we will check whether that item is present over there or not. So for a cluster size of 2, we got 3 comparison. And in a case when we get to the last of the hash table, then we will do the modulus. Like suppose X was 8, then we do 8 plus plus, we got 9. Then we do 9 plus plus. So every time we are taking modulus with size of the hash table mod 10. So 8 plus 8 mod 10, 8, 9 mod 10, 9. Then 9 plus plus is 10, 10 mod 10 is 0. So again we will start checking from the beginning. So what happens is, suppose we got an item at this cluster 8. Suppose X was this. So this is occupied, one comparison happened. Then we checked at the next cluster 9. One comparison happened, it is still occupied. Then we checked it 9 plus 1, 10 mod 10, which is 0. So one comparison happened and it is occupied. Then we checked it 0 plus 1 mod 10, which is 1 mod 10. One comparison happened and it is still occupied. Then we checked it 1 plus 1 2 mod 10. One comparison again happened and it is empty. So we will put our item S8 over here. The number of comparisons equals to size of largest cluster, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 plus 1, which is 5. It is 4 plus 1 equals to 5 for linear probing. So the answer is option B. This question belongs to programming subject and the topic name is parameter passing. It was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, in which of the following cases which means multiple answers are possible, is it possible to obtain different results for call by reference and call by name parameter passing? So there are various types of parameter passing like call by reference, call by name, call by value. But here only call by reference and call by name has been referred. Passing an expression as a parameter, passing an array as a parameter, passing a pointer as a parameter, passing an array element as a parameter, and both A and A. So let me tell you what is call by reference and call by name. So what happens in call by reference is that we are just passing a pointer variable. A pointer variable is nothing but it is a variable which is storing some address of some other data which is stored at some other address. Let us suppose this is address 1000, this is 1002, this is data 10. So this variable A is called a pointer variable as it is storing address 1000. What happens in call by name? We all have studied that macro substitution. So call by name happens similar to that macro substitution. Here, what happens is that we have a formal argument. Let us suppose we are calling we have a function f which takes x as an input, and we are in our main we are calling this function x with 3. Then what happens is that wherever it in call by name, each occurrence of the formal parameter is replaced by the actual argument text. So let us suppose 3 came over here. If it was 3 plus 2, let us suppose 3 plus 2. So 3 plus 2 came over here. So wherever x will be there in the program, it will be replaced by 3 plus 2. It will happen in the runtime. At runtime, the replacing happens. So it is similar to that macro substitution which happens in the runtime. Now we have to tell like in which of the following call by reference and call by name will give different results. So for this, let me give you an example. Let us suppose we have a code like this. We have a function int which returns an integer value. It's called a foo. It takes a parameter int x and the function is defined as follows. It does nothing but it just returns x into x. Now let us assume we have call by reference, call by name. Let us first do call by name. Call by name. If we are doing call by name and we are passing an expression as a parameter, let us suppose the expression is 2 plus 3. Then 2 plus 3 is passed into x. Then at runtime, all these x's will be replaced by 2 plus 3. So we will get over here 2 plus 3 into 2 plus 3. So what will it return? We know we have to go by the precedence table, or we can also say by BODMAS. So if we go by precedence, multiplication has higher precedence. So this will be evaluated first. So we will get 2 plus 3 into 6. 3 to 2, 6 plus 3. We will get 11. So call by name will give output as 11. And if in this case we have call by reference, then what will happen is that let us suppose we have call by reference. So what call by reference does is that we have call by reference for the same. If we are passing 2 plus 3 in call by reference. So what call by reference does is that it creates a temporary variable. Let us suppose temp1 and it evaluates it and store its value. So it will store 5 in this temporary variable and pass this variable over here. So x will get 5. So here x will get 5, x will get 5, so we will get 25. So call by reference will give 25 and call by name will get 11. So here both the answers will be different if we are passing an expression as a parameter. Let us take the second option, passing an array as a parameter. If we are passing an arrays, so array is nothing, it's just the base address. Passing an array means passing the base address. And in passing the base address, call by reference and call by name will give the same outputs. So this is not the correct option. Passing a pointer as a parameter. Passing a pointer means passing an array as a parameter. It's similar to that, and passing a pointer means passing an address. If we are passing an address, then all the contents will be same. The result will be same for call by reference and for call by name. Now let us see this option, passing an array element as a parameter. It's different from passing an array as a parameter. Here we are passing an element of an array as a parameter. Let me give you a code so that we can analyze this more carefully. So if we have a code like this, let us suppose this is the main function Here we have defined an array to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then what we do, we define an int I equals to 0. Then we call a function fun with a of I, and then we print a of 0, a of 0. Now we need to define this function fun. So how will we define this? Let us suppose this function is represented like this. Fun, it takes a parameter x, and what it does is that it just do int I equals to 1 and x equals to 8. So let us suppose this is a dummy code that we will analyze for call by reference and for call by value. So what happens for call by name? Let us do first for call by name. So what happens for call by name? Let us suppose we come to this main function, we do I equals to 0, then we call a of I. So when we call a of I by call by name, then what happens? X takes a of I. So wherever x is there, a of I will come. It's similar to macro substitution. So how will it evaluate? It will do I equals to 1, a of I equals to 8. So what is I value? I value is 1 in this function, so a of 1 equals to 8. So it will change this 1 to 8, and when we will come back to this main function, it will print a of 0. A of 0, the answer will be 0. So for call by name, the answer will be 0. Now let us do for call by reference. So what happens in call by references? Let me first erase this stuff. So yeah, let me complete these functions first. 0 followed by 1 followed by 2, 3, 4, and here it was taking input in x, it was doing x equals to 8. Yeah, so what happens now is, let us suppose we are doing call by reference. In call by reference, we are calling a of I. So when we call a of I over here, then x takes the reference of a of I, the address, and here I equals to 1, so nothing is changed, only the a of I. When we are calling a of I, then 0 is passed. So a of 0 is passed, the address of a of 0 is passed. X takes the address of a of 0, and here x takes the address of a of 0. So what we do a of 0 equals to 8. It do not have any effect of this change a of I equals to 1, as the address was passed. So a of 0 becomes 8, and when we come over here back and we print a of 0, then we get answer to be 8 by call by reference. We get answer to be 8. Thus, we can clearly see when we are using call by reference and call by name, then we get different answers when we are passing an array element as a parameter. Here a of I was passed, which is an array element, and we have got different answers for call by name and call by reference. And same was for passing an expression as a parameter. We have passed 2 plus 3 as a parameter. Here it was passed directly. Here we have created a temporary variable and we got different answers 11 and 25. Thus option A and D are true. Thus option A and D means option E, which states both A and D are true. So answer is option E. This question belongs to compiler design subject and the topic name is parsers. It was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question is basically fill in the blanks question, which states merging states with a common core may produce dash conflicts and does not produce dash conflicts in a LALR parser. So what is the meaning of this common core? So common core basically means the LR0 items in the parser. You need to remember this, that common core refers to the LR0 item. And what we know about LR0 item? We know that LR0 item do not have look ahead symbols. Do not have look ahead symbols. Now, when in LALR1, what we are doing in LALR1 is that we are merging the states obtained in CLR1. So we are merging the states obtained in CLR1 to get LALR1, and CLR1 states which are merged are those which have a common core, which have same core, or we can say same LR0 item. Only those states are merged, but may have, but these states may have different lookaheads. And we know when we are merging those CLR1 items to form LALR1, then two conditions can occur. The first one is that in CLR1 table, if no SR conflict is there, if no shift reduce conflict is there, then no SR conflict will be there in LALR1. And the second thing is, observation is, in CLR1 table, if no reduce conflict is there, then there may or may not be RR conflict. May not be RR conflict in LALR1. So you need to remember just these two statements. If there is no SR conflict, then there will be no SR conflict in LALR1. If there is no RR conflict in CLR1, then there may or may not be RR conflict in LALR1. Now let us answer this. So it's asking merging states with a common core. Common core means same LR0 items. May produce. So what? It may produce RR conflict. So the answer is it may produce RR, or we can say reduce conflicts, and does not produce, SR conflict. SR means shift reduce conflict. So the answer is RR and CR. This question belonged to engineering mathematics subject and was asked in GATE 1989, and the topic name is sets and relation. So the question states the transitive closure of the relation. We are given a relation on some set S. This is relation R on some set S. We need to find the transitive closure of the relation on the set S. It is a fill in the blanks question. So what is a transitive closure? Transitive closure is a minimal relation. Transitive closure of R is a minimal relation which is transitive and has all elements of R. So let us see. What is our relation? Our relation has 1, 2. Our relation has 2, 3. Our relation has 3, 4. Our relation has 5, 4. So what is transitivity? Transitivity means if AB belongs to R and BC belongs to R, then AC must belong to R. So let us see where transitivity is failing. 1, 2 belongs to R, 2, 3 belongs to R. So 1, 3 must belongs to R. Here 2, 3 belongs to R, 3, 4 belongs to R. So 2, 4 must belong to R. And 1, 2 belongs to R and 2, 4 belongs to R. So 1, 4 must belongs to R. So the answer is, the relation is 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 4, 3, 4, and 5, 4. We can also do it by another shortcut method. It will take less time. So what we need to do, we can do it by graphs. So we just need to draw the vertices which is equal to all the elements of the set. 1, 2, 3, 4 as well as 5. Now it will be a directed graph. So edges will be according to the relation. So source will be the first item, destination will be the second item. So 1 to 2 there will be an edge, 2 to 3 there will be an edge, 3 to 4 there will be an edge, 5 to 4 there will be an edge. And all pairs I and j belong to our transitive closure of R if there exists a path from I to J in the graph obtained. So let us see. 1 to 2, is there a path? Yes. 1 to 2 is there. 1 to 3, is there a path? Yes. Through 2. So 1 to 3 belongs to the relation. 1 to 4, is there a path? Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 to 5, is there a path? No. 1, 2, 3, 4, but we can't come to 5. 2 to 3, is there a path? Yes. Direct path is there. Direct edge is there. 2 to 4, yes. There is a path through 3. 2 to 5, no. There is no path. We can't come to 5. 3 to 4, yes. There is a direct path. 3 to 5, no. There is no direct path. 4 to 5, no. There is no path. 5 to 4, yes. There is a path from 5 to 4. So we again got the same relation that we have derived earlier. So we can also do it by this method or by this method. So the answer is, this is the relation. This question belongs to computer organization subject and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, match the pairs in the following questions. So it will match the following question. A, cyclic redundancy code, serial communication, open collector, Hamming code. We have to match this list 1 with the list 2 containing error correction, wired or error detection, and RS-232C. So let us first see this error CRC and Hamming code. We know there are two types of code. We have error detection code. Like when we are transmitting some data, then it might be possible that due to some disturbance, some data may get corrupted. So we have two methods. For one is error detection method and second one is error correcting method. So in GATE syllabus, error detecting methods can be our parity methods. We have odd parity and even parity method. We have checksum method, and we have CRC, which is cyclic redundancy code method. And error correction methods are of various types, but in GATE we have only Hamming code method. So what it does, it also corrects the error which had occurred, and it only detects the error whether there is an error or not. There are other types too, like binary convolution and many other, but as far as GATE is concerned, only Hamming code, parity, checksum, and CRC are concerned. So now let us match CRC. What is CRC? CRC is error detection code. So error detection. So it's R. A is mapped to R. What is Hamming code? Hamming code is an error correction code. So D is mapped to P. So D is mapped to P. So basically, CRC is an error detection code commonly used in digital networks and storage devices to detect accidental changes to raw data. So we had raw data. There might be some accidental change due to some electric charge or during transmission. Thus, we are using error detection code to detect whether there was an error or not. Now let us see this serial communication. So we are using RS-232C. It's basically the physical interface that our computer is using to talk to and exchange data with our modem. This is our computer and this is modem. So it is the physical interface. This physical interface is RS-232. It's a standard interface that we are using to exchange data with a modem and other serial devices. So serial communication is mapped to S. So we got RS, RS, this is mapped to S. Then what is open collector? So open collector is basically a transistor. It utilizes a transistor as a switch that connects or disconnects an integrated circuit. We have an IC chip, its output it connects or disconnects with the ground instead of outputting a specific voltage or current. It's basically related to wired OR. It is not directly related with gate, but as since only this option is left, so it is mapped to Q. So the answer is RSQP. This question belongs to computer organization subject and was asked in GATE 1989. So the question state match the pair in the following question. So it's match the following. Here we have two lists, list 1 and list 2. List 1 states all the addressing mode, base addressing mode, index addressing mode, stack addressing mode and implied addressing mode. And we need to match it to the following things: re-entenancy, accumulator, array and position independency. Let us see all the addressing modes one by one. We have base addressing mode. So what an base addressing mode does is that in base addressing mode, we have a base register, and we calculate the effective address by combining the value of base register and the address field. So here the instruction will be something like this. We will have an opcode and we will have an address field. So effective address is calculated by combining the value of base register and this address field. We will get the effective address in the memory where our opcode is present, operand is present. Now, so it is used for inter-segment transfer. Like suppose now we want to map to another location due to position independency. Then we can change the value of the base register and we can get the new effective address. Thus, A is mapped to as base addressing mode is used for position independency or inter-segment transfer. Now let us see indexed addressing mode. So what happens in indexed addressing mode is, in index addressing mode, we will have our opcode followed by a value like R1. Let me give you an example. We will have something like add register R1 with R2. So what is basically happening is, here the effective address is basically in a register, and register is given in instruction. So here effective address is in the register R2. So we have a register R2 which have a effective address, and this register is given in instruction. R2 is present in the instruction. So here what we will do, R1 is going to store the value of R1 plus the value which is at memory location R2. So we will first go to this address location R2, we will check the effective address, then we will go to the RAM at this effective address and we will get our operand, and then we will add this to R2, and then after doing this we will do R2 plus plus, which means R2 will have effective address plus plus. It will point to the next location and then again to the next location, again to the next location. So where it can be useful, we know that in an array we have sequential access, so we need to access next item. Like in loops you may need to access next item, so it is used in the arrays for indexing. Thus index addressing mode can be mapped to option R. Now let us see the third addressing mode, which is stack addressing mode. So what happens in stack addressing mode is that in stack addressing mode we will just have our operation that we need to perform. Let us suppose we will have in stack addressing mode we will just have the add operation. Here we will be having a stack, and stack will be having the contents, let us suppose 10, 20, 30. So it's a zero address instruction. We just give the opcode, no operand is given. So add means we will go to the stack, pop the first two items 20 and 30, add them. So 20 plus 30 equals to 50, and then we will push 50 over here, which means we will perform the operation on the stack. And why is it useful? Like let us suppose it is used for re-entenancy, which means again if we run the same program for instance 2, then the address will be different. The operations will be performed at different address. A stack will have this, may have the same content, but those address will be different. Thus it is mapped to re-entenancy, which means at each iteration the address would be different. Now let us see the next addressing mode, which is implied addressing mode. So implied addressing mode is basically used for zero address instructions. Let me show you implied addressing mode. So an example of implied addressing mode is, we can give an example like CLC, which means clear the carry flag. We can give an example like INCA, which means increment the accumulator. So all these are zero address instructions. We do not give any address. And here basically in most of the time the operation is performed on the accumulator, as no address is given, so by default we assume it to be accumulator. So INC means increment accumulator value. So as it is zero address instruction, by default we assume accumulator. Thus implied addressing mode is mapped to accumulator. Thus the options mapping is S, R, P and Q. This question belongs to data structure subject and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, match the pairs in the following questions. So it's match the following. Here we have order of log n, order of n, order of n log n, order of n square, list 1, and list 2 has heap sort, depth first search, binary search, selection of the kth smallest element in the set of n elements. So we basically need to find the complexity of all these algorithms. So let us see them one by one. Heap sort. So we know how heap sort works. Heap sort works on heap. So what is an heap? Heap is an almost complete binary tree. Heap is an almost complete binary tree. Almost complete binary tree means all the levels will be completely filled and last level will be filled from left to right. What is the height of heap? Height of heap is log n base 2. Thus, and what is an heapify operation? An heapify operation means deleting the item. When we delete an item, then we just replace it from the last item and then delete the last item. And then we need to perform the heapify operation in order to maintain the heap property. And that heapify will check through all the length of the tree and it will take order of log n time, as the length of an ACBT is almost complete binary tree is log n. And what happens during heap sort? During heap sort, we will perform deletion of all the n items one by one and keep storing them backwards. So heap sort complexity will be for n times heapify complexity, which is equals to order of n log n. So heap sort is mapped to order of n log n, which is C. So C is mapped to P, heap sort. Now let us see the next one. The next one is DFS, depth first search. We know what is a DFS. A DFS is nothing but we would be given a graph and then we can start with any vertex and we need to traverse it depth first. Like suppose if we come over here, then the next vertex will be here, then the next one will be this. We will go to the entire depth. The next one will be this, the next one will be this. So there are complexity is equals to order of, there are two methods to represent a graph. Either we can have adjacency list method or we can have adjacency matrix method to represent a graph. What is an adjacency list method? In adjacency list method, we will have all the vertices over here and all the edges will be represented like this. Like if A is connected to B, then it will be represented by this. If A is connected to C, it will be represented by this. If B is connected to C, it will be represented by this. So what is complexity in adjacency list? We just need to scan this entire list and it's equal to there are V vertices and E edges. So in adjacency list, complexity is order of V plus E. We can assume it to be order of N, assuming we have sparse graph. And in adjacency matrix, we have V rows and V columns. Let us suppose we have 3 vertices, then we have 3 rows and 3 columns. And suppose there is an edge between B and A, we will have entry as 1. And if there is no edge, we will have entry as 0. So its complexity will be order of V into V, which is equals to order of N square. So here DFS will take order of N, order of V plus E or order of N in adjacency list and order of N square in adjacency matrix. Here as we can see, so either DFS can map to B or DFS can map to D. We will remove this confusion later on. Now let us see the next option. So next option is binary search. So what an binary search is? In binary search, we would be given a list of items or an array. We will first come to the mid item. Let us suppose the items are 10, 20, 30, 40 as well as 50. So we will come to mid, which is 10. Let us suppose we are searching 8. If 8 is less than 10, then we will go to the left. And if the item that we are searching, if we were searching 45, if the item we are searching is greater than the mid, then we will go to the right. So its complexity is, it basically divides the list into two halves plus C time for basically dividing. So by using Master's theorem, its complexity will come out to be order of n log n. Okay, so binary search is mapping to order of log n. Sorry, if you use Master's theorem, then it will map to order of log n. You can also see n raised to the power log base b of a. It is a, it is b. So it's equal to n log base b base 2 of 1. Log 1 is 0, n to the power 0, it's 1. And as this is also c and this is also c, so by rule of Master's theorems, it will be equal to c into log n, which is equals to order of log n. So it is mapping to log n. Binary search is mapping to log n, which means mapping to a, which means a is mapping to r and p was mapping to c. Yeah. Now we have this selection procedure, which is we want to find the kth smallest element. So basically we have many methods for finding the kth smallest element, but I will tell you the most efficient one. First, let me tell you what will be the less efficient method for finding the kth smallest element. So we will be given an array. Let us suppose this is the array over here with the items 10, 20, 30, 40, 45, 52, 57, and they may be in random order, like we can have, they may be in unsorted order. So we can have them like this. You can have 10, 20, 57, 40, 15, 8, 3, 9. Yeah, they can be unsorted array. It's 20. So we need to find, we will be given a value of k. Let us suppose k equals to 3, and we need to find the third smallest element. So what's third smallest element here? So first smallest is 3, second smallest is 8, third smallest is 9. So we need to output 9. So what can be the complexities? Like we can think of a solution in which we will sort this in order of n log n by using any sorting method, merge sort or heap sort or any other. And then we will give the third item at index 3. It can be done in order of 1. So it can come out to be order of n log n. But we can see order of n log n is already taken up by the binary search. It's already taken up by heap sort. So we need to think of another method for finding the kth smallest element. So I will tell you a method. We will use partitioning method. Partitioning algo method. So what happens here is that we will select any item as the pivot, the first item we select as the pivot. Then what happens after its complexity, pivot selection complexity will be order of n. Then 10 will come at its position. All the items less than 10 will come on its left. If it will be 8, 3, 9, not necessarily in the same order. And then we will have all the items greater than 10 on its right. 40 as well as 15 on the right, not necessarily in the same order. Now again we will check whether what is the position of 10. We will see its first position, second position, third position, fourth position. 10 is at its fourth position, which means we have found the fourth smallest item. So where will we get the third smallest item? The third smallest item will definitely be on the left. Then we will come on the left, make next any item as the pivot. Let us assume 8 as the pivot. So 8 will come at its position, less than 8 will come on the left, more than 8 will come on the right. What is position of 8? Position of 8 is 2, which means we have found the second smallest item. Now we need to find the third smallest, so we will go on the right. Now we will make 9 as pivot. 9 will come at its exact position, all the items less than 9 on the left, greater than 9 on the right. 40, 15, it's at position 3, which matches with k, which means we have found the kth smallest element. So what will be its complexity? Its complexity will be, we are just performing the partitioning n, and at each time we are just checking n by 2. So what will its complexity come out to be? But here there is a logic. Here we are not performing this for the entire part. Here this pivot selection can be done only for constant time. Only for some constant time we will be doing this partitioning. So it will be equal to order of n into c, which is equals to order of n. Or I can tell you another method for this, finding the kth smallest element. So the method goes on like this. What we will do, we will be given an array, we will be given the value of k. So first of all, we will create a heap. Create a heap by which method? By build heap method. What will be complexity of creating a heap? It will be order of n. So what is the complexity of deleting an item from the heap? I have told you earlier, if you delete it, you replace it with the last item. Do heapify, it takes order of n time. So if you can create a min heap is created, and do one deletion. If you do one deletion, what is the complexity? Order of log n for heapify. And after one deletion, as min heap has the minimum item at the top, you will get the min item out. And if you can do k deletions, what will be the complexity? Each one equal to k. So order of k into log n. So k deletion complexity is this, build heap complexity is this. But see, this k is always a constant number and we can neglect the constants. So total complexity will be order of n plus order of k log n, but you can neglect this k as it is constant, so it will be equal to order of n plus log n, and it will be equal to order of n. So time complexity for selecting the k smallest element is equal to order of n, which maps to option B. So option B maps to S, and here we had two options, either option B or option D. As option B is eliminated, thus we assume that we have used adjacency matrix, and this binary search maps to D and D maps to Q. So the correct matching is R, S, P and Q. This question belongs to operating system subject and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, match the pairs in the following questions. So we have been given two lists, list 1 and list 2. List 1 has items virtual memory, shared memory, look ahead buffer and look aside buffer. And list 2 has items temporal locality, spatial locality, address translation and mutual exclusion. So let us map one by one. Virtual memory. So what is a virtual memory? Virtual memory is basically a logical concept. What it says is that virtual memory allows processes larger than physical memory. So we have physical memory RAM. Let us suppose we have 4 GB RAM. But nowadays we can see we even have hundreds of GBs of game. So does it mean that we can't run these games on our system? No, it doesn't mean. Does it mean we need 100 GB of RAM? No, it is not like that. So we divide the page into process into various frames and load each frame into a page of a RAM. So virtual memory allows processes larger than physical memory by breaking them into chunks and instructions which are closed from these chunks. Spatial localities, if we use something in memory, you will probably need the thing closer by this. So let us suppose we break it over here and we bring this page over here. Then the some parts of it which are close to it are also brought. This is called spatial locality. So virtual memory can be mapped to spatial locality. And also virtual memory can also be mapped to address translation, because if we have virtual memory, then basically we will be given a logical address. So we need to convert, do the address translation. No, we need to convert. CPU always generate logical address. So we need to convert this logical address to physical address. It will have page number and frame number, and page number, frame number should be converted to the actual page number and frame number of this process, which is basically called the address translation. So address translation can also come here, over here. So virtual memory can be mapped to cube or as well as R. Now let us see shared memory. What is a shared memory? Shared memory concept is related to the critical section. So what it says is that, let us suppose we have two codes P1 and P2. What P1 does is that P1 reads a, P1 increments a, and P1 writes a. And what P2 does is that P2 reads A, P2 decrements A, let us suppose, and P2 writes A. And let us suppose A is shared and having a value 10. Now, if they are executed one after the another, which means P1 followed by P2 or P2 followed by P1. So P1 will read 10, increment it to 11 in its local memory and then write 11 over here. It will write over here 11. Then P2 will come and read A to be 11, decrement 11 to 10, then write 10 over here. So the final output would be 10. But let us suppose we are having concurrent execution, as we generally prefer concurrent executions. So what happens in case of concurrent execution? We will have A equals to 10. Let us suppose P1 comes and reads A to be 10. Then simultaneously it gets preempted and P2 comes and reads A to be 10. Then P2 decrements A and makes 9. Then P2 writes A and writes 9 over here. Then P1 comes and increments A. Then P1 has stored 10 in its local memory, so it will increment 10 to 11. Then it writes 11 over here. So what's the final output? If we are having P1 concurrent to P2, then output will be 11. There are other outputs also possible, but we can easily see that there is inconsistency in data. So this inconsistency is basically removed by concurrency control protocols like semaphores, lock variable, turn variable. But the main thing is whenever we are having a variable in a shared memory, then we need mutual exclusion, which means only one process should be able to access that location at a particular point of time. Thus, shared memory can be easily mapped to mutual exclusion because mutual exclusion is used to prevent the race condition when we are accessing the shared memory. Now, let us see the other two concepts. So, the third concept is of look ahead buffer. So, what is a look ahead buffer? Look ahead buffer works something like this. Let us suppose as we know, CPU always generates a logical address. Okay, so let us see. CPU will always generate a logical address, but what happens is that some pages, let us suppose these are some pages. So what look ahead buffer does is that some of the pages which are nearby or ahead are also loaded in the buffer, hoping they will be accessed in the future. So let us suppose this page is being referred, but along with this we may load this page also and this page also in some disk with the hope that it may be referred in the future, and this is called spatial locality. So look ahead buffer is related to spatial locality, which is R. Now let us see the next one, look aside buffer. So what is a look aside buffer? Look, or we can also call it as TLB. It's a hardware data structure that we have learned, or we can call it as look aside buffer. So what is a TLB help is let us suppose CPU always generates logical address. A logical address is page number and page offset. And we have this process divided into pages, main memory divided into frames, and then we have various levels of page tables. So what happens is that we will search in the outer page table, then in the corresponding inner page table, then in the innermost page table, and then we will get the corresponding data from the main memory. But instead of doing through all these memory accesses, we maintain a hardware data structure which is called TLB. We just have this, and when we get an entry, we just update it in the TLB with the hope that it will be used in the future. And whenever we are converting logical address to physical address, we will first check the TLB entry. If it is present in the TLB, we will directly access the data. And if it is not present, then it will be a TLB miss, and then we will again go through this page table routine. So because TLB helps to make the translation from virtual address to physical address faster, we keep the page addresses or the frame address pair hoping that it will be again needed in the near future. And what is temporal locality? Temporal locality is if we use something now, you will probably need it soon. Thus, TLB is basically related to temporal locality. As we have stored the page frame number over here with the hope that we will be needing the same page in the near future. So, look aside buffer can be related to temporal locality. What other thing can it be related to? It can also be related to address translation, as here address translation is happening from logical address to physical address. Thus, it can also be mapped to address translation, which is R. Now we will remove the discrepancies. Like this one is for sure S. It can be mapped only to one. Look ahead buffer can only be mapped to Q. Now A can be mapped to Q and R, but Q is already present, so A will be mapped to R, and B will be mapped can be mapped to P or R, but R is used, so it will be mapped to P. So the correct mapping is RSQP. Virtual memory is mapped to address translation. Shared memory is mapped to mutual exclusion. Look ahead buffer is mapped to spatial locality, and look aside buffer is mapped to temporal locality. This question belongs to programming subject and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, an unrestricted use of goto statement is harmful because of the following reasons. So what are the reasons? It makes it more difficult to verify program. It makes program more inefficient. It makes it more difficult to modify existing programs. It results in the compiler generating long machine code. Let us see the option B. What is it saying? It is saying it makes program more inefficient. No, goto has no rule in making a program inefficient, as adding a goto statement introduces a branch instruction, but assuming the same program logic can never be avoided, and even if it is replaced with the for, while, or if statements, we will still have a branch instruction. So option B is incorrect. Let us see option C. What is it saying? It makes it more difficult to modify existing programs. No, actually, using a goto kind of makes it easy to modify an existing program, as making the control flow from line, say, line number X to line number Y, X to Y, we can simply do a goto. We can do goto address of Y. We can just use a goto. This is much harder to do in a proper structured way. So this is also false. Let us see option D. Option D says it results in the compiler generating longer machine code. No, this is also false, as goto introduces only a single jump statement. As we have goto and address X, it will be replaced just by a jump instruction. Machine code will be its equivalent opcode for jump. So jump will be the equivalent opcode for goto, followed by the destination address. Here we will have the destination address where we need to jump, and the equivalent structural constructs will have longer machine codes. So it's false, as it's replaced just by jump and it is shorter machine code. And let us see option A. So option A, you can easily see a Wikipedia document regarding the same, which tells that option A is true. I will show you the document. So here is the document. Here you can easily see what option A was saying. Option A was saying that it makes it more difficult to verify programs. Okay, see from here, from this line, it's written, probably the most famous criticism of goto in 1989 letter by Edsager Dijkstra called the goto statement considered harmful. In this letter, Dijkstra argued that unrestricted goto statements should be abolished from high-level languages because they complicate the task of analyzing and verifying the correctness of programs. And this is what it is referring to. Thus, option A is true. This question belongs to Theory of Computational Subject, and the topic name is Regular Language and Context-Free Language. It was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, context-free languages and regular languages are both closed under the operations of union, intersection, concatenation, complementation, both union and concatenation. So for these type of questions, it's better to remember a table so that you can easily answer all those questions. I will tell you what the table is. Here is the property. Here is about regular language. Here is about context-free language. Context-free language. Here we will tell whether it's closed or not closed under a property. Closed will be represented by a tick, and not closed will be represented by a cross. Not closed means it may be closed, it may not be closed. So the operations are union, intersection, set difference. It's good to remember this table so that you can answer all the questions very fast. Complement, intersection with regular language, concatenation. So what all are closed? All these are closed. All these are closed under regular language. And in context-free language, union is closed, intersection with regular language is closed, and concatenation is closed. And what else is not closed? Others are not closed. They may be closed or may not be closed. So the question was asking regular language and context-free language both are closed under the operations. So let's see, both are closed under union, both are closed under intersection with regular language, and both are closed under concatenation. So here union and concatenation. So answer is option E. Option A and C both are true. This question belongs to theory of computational subject and was asked in GATE 1989. So the question belongs to undecidability and decidability topic. The question states, which of the following problems are undecidable? Membership problem in context-free languages, whether the given CFL is regular or not, whether a finite state automation halts on all inputs, membership problem for type languages. So for these decidable and undecidable languages, identifying problem, it's better to remember a table so that you can do it very easily. This is a table, so let me iterate you through all. These are all the types of grammar: regular grammar, DCFL, deterministic context-free language, context-free language, context-sensitive language, recursively enumerable language, recursive language, and recursively enumerable language. And it is whether a given string belongs to a language, which is membership test. It is whether a language represents a file, which means it is empty language. It is whether the language equals to sigma star, which is it has all the possible strings. It is whether one language is a subset of the other. It is whether two languages are equal. It is whether the intersection of two languages is empty, which means they are mutually exclusive. It asks whether a given language is regular. It asks whether a given language is finite. So let us see the options. So option A is membership problem for context-free languages. D means decidable, UD means undecidable. So membership problem, this is membership problem. For context-free language, it's decidable. So it's decidable. Option B, whether a given context-free language is regular or not. So context-free language, whether it's regular or not, it's undecidable problem. So it is undecidable. Option C, whether a finite state automation halt on all input. I will explain you this. Option D, membership problem for type 0 languages. What is type 0 language? This one, RE language is a type 0 language. So membership problem for type 0 language is undecidable. So it's undecidable. Now let us see the reasoning behind each of the options. So option A stated membership problem in context-free language. It is decidable as we can have various membership algorithms for CFL class of languages. Like we have a CYK algo, we have LLK algo, which you have read in the compiler design subject. We have LRK parsing algorithms, which also we have read in the compiler design subject. In fact, the upper bound to determine if a string belongs to if W belongs to context-free language or not, the upper bound for determining this is order of n cube in the worst case scenario. By using this CYK algorithm, we can do it in order of n cube, and best case can be done on order of n. This is the best case and this is the worst case. As we have algos for this, thus it is a decidable problem. Now let us see the option C. What option C is saying is that whether a finite state automation halt on all input. It is basically a trivial problem, as a finite state automation is basically a specific case of halting Turing machine. with limited power. Halting Turing machine has more power and finite state automation have less power. Hence, it is also a decidable problem. Because halting machine Turing problem is decidable, so finite state automata halting problem is also decidable. Now let us see the option D. So what is a type 0 language? Type 0 language is recursively enumerable language. So type 0 language, all recursively enumerable languages are not recursive and hence cannot be necessarily modeled by halting Turing machine. All RE languages are not REC and hence we cannot have a Turing machine for all RE languages. So possibility is that there may be some cases of rejection of input. The Turing machine may not halt for some of the input. Thus, membership problem is undecidable for RE languages or type 0 languages. Thus, it is decidable only for option A and C. So it is MSQ, or we can have an option A which says both A and C. So option A and C are correct. This question belongs to engineering mathematics subject and was asked in GATE 1989, and the topic name is propositional logic. So it asks which of the following well-formed formulas are equivalent. P implies Q, negation of Q implies negation of P, negation of P or Q, negation of Q implies P. The negation has different forms of writing it. Either we can write negation of P like this, or P complement, or P dash. All of them are correct. We can also write negation of P like this. So these are standard formula for A implies B. A implies B means if A, then B. So it is equivalent to negation of A or B. Or we can write in this question term negation of A or B. So let us see option A. P implies Q. P implies Q can be written as negation of P or Q. Now let us see option B. Option B says negation of Q implies negation of P. It can be written as negation of Q, just expanding this formula, or negation of P. And negation of Q is equals to Q. So it is equal to Q or negation of P. Or it is, as this or is commutative, so we can also write it as negation of P or Q. Let us see option C. It is negation of P or Q. Let us see option D. Its negation of Q implies P. It is equivalent to negation of Q or P, and it is equivalent to Q or P. Now let us see the options. So as we know, it is A is equivalent to negation of P or Q, B is equivalent to negation of P or Q, C is equivalent to negation of P or Q, and D is equivalent to P or Q. So option A, B and C are equivalent. So the correct answer is option E. A, B and C are equivalent. This question belongs to engineering mathematics subject and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. It is related to planarity and planar graphs. So the question asks which of the following is a planar. We are given three graphs G1, G2 and G3 and we need to tell which of the following graph is a planar. So what is a planar graph? A planar graph is a graph which can be represented on a plane. So a planar graph is a graph which can be represented on a plane. Represented on a plane means represented on a sheet of paper, you can assume. It can be represented on a sheet of paper such that any two edges intersect only at endpoints, which means we can have two edges intersecting like this. This is planar graph. We can have this, but two edges can't intersect in between. Like two edges can't intersect in between. This is not a planar graph, but this is a planar graph. As we have a vertex in between, so no two edge is intersecting from between. They are meeting only at the endpoints. So we have a very important theorem for the planar graph, which will help us in answering this question. If M is number of edges in a planar graph. It's a corollary, and it's a corollary. If m is the number of edges and n is the number of vertices, then for a planar graph, m should be less than equal to 2n minus 4. So let us verify this for all these graphs. So here, what is the value of m? So m over here is 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And what is n? N over here is 6. So is 9 less than equal to 2 into 6 minus 4? Is 9 less than equals to 8? No. So it's not a planar graph. Is this a planar graph? Let us verify m. What is the value of m over here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. M is 12. What is the value of n? Value of n is 8. Is m less than equal to 2 into n minus 4? 12 is less than equal to 16 minus 4, 12. But if we are able to verify this, then it doesn't mean that the graph is planar. If this is not verified, if this condition is false, then it means, if this is false, then it means graph is not planar. And if this condition holds, if this condition is true, then G may or may not be planar. May or may not be planar. And for that, we need to verify it by drawing the planar equivalent. So we can draw the planar equivalent of this one as like this. We can draw the planar equivalent like over here. We can have like this, an edge like that, and edge like that. So this is the planar equivalent of the graph G2 with no two edges intersecting from the middle. So G2 is planar. Let us find the value of number of edges and number of vertices for G3. So number of edges over here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And number of m and n. And number of vertices over here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 9 is less than equal to 2 into 6 minus 4. 9 is less than equal to 12 minus 4, 8. This is false. So G3 is also not planar. G1 is also not planar. So the answer is G2 is planar. And we can also see that G1 and G3 are isomorphic to each other. So if G1 is not planar, then G3 is also not planar. So the answer is G2. This question belongs to engineering mathematics subject from the topic probability and was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, which of the following statements are false? For Poisson distribution, the mean is twice the variance. In queuing theory, if arrival occurs according to Poisson distribution, then inter-arrival time is exponentially distributed. The distribution of waiting time is independent of the service discipline used in selecting the waiting customers for service. If the time between successive arrivals is exponential, then the time between the occurrence of every third arrival is also exponential. Option E, both A and C. So what is a Poisson distribution? A Poisson distribution is basically a discrete probability function. What is the meaning of this discrete probability function? It means that the variable can take specific values from a given list of numbers. We can have infinite list of numbers, and the variable can take only a finite set of values. A probability distribution function is used to measure how many times an event is likely to occur within an x period of time. Like we have x1 period, x2 period. So how likely an event is going to occur within this x period of time is measured by the probability distribution function. So for option A, for Poisson distribution, the mean is twice the variance. This is false. This is true for another type of distribution which is called binomial distribution. So for a binomial distribution, we can say mean equals to twice variance. So this is false. Option B. In queuing theory, if arrival occurs according to Poisson distribution, then the inter-arrival time is exponentially distributed. This is true. Option C. The distribution of waiting time is independent of the service discipline used in selecting the waiting customers for service. No, this is false. It is dependent. It's not independent. The correct thing is it's dependent. So this option is also false. If the time between successive arrivals is exponential, then the time between the occurrences of every third arrival is also exponential. This is also true. So the statements which are false are A and C are false, and we need to tell which are false. So answer is option E. Both A and C are false. This question belongs to data structure subject and was asked in GATE 1989. So the question states which of the following statements are false. Option A, overlaying is used to run a program which is longer than the address space of the computer. Option B, optimal binary search tree construction can be performed efficiently by using dynamic programming. Option C, depth first search cannot be used to find connected components of a graph. Option D, given the prefix and postfix walls of a binary tree, the binary tree can be uniquely constructed. Let us see all the options one by one. So what is an overlay? So overlaying is basically a concept which is basically used to increase the address space usage when physical memory, like we have RAM as physical memory. When we have limited RAM, then overlaying is used to increase the address space usage when we have limited physical memory on the systems. So, but the question is asking overlaying is used to run a program which is longer than the address space of the computer. But overlay cannot increase the address space. Here the address space means the logical address space. Overlay cannot increase the logical address space. It is just used to run when the physical address is limited for us. Or we can also say that address space by default means the logical address space, and overlay is a technique which is used to run a program which is bigger than the size of physical memory or the RAM by keeping only those instructions and data that are needed at a given point of time, but it cannot increase the address space. Thus option A is false. Option B, optimal binary search tree construction can be performed efficiently by using dynamic programming. So what is a optimal binary search tree? A binary search tree is a normal binary search tree in which all the items less than x will come on the left, all the items greater than x will come on the right, here will be less than x, here will be greater than x. So in an optimal binary search tree, we will be given an array of elements. They are the keys k1, k2, k3 and kn. They will be sorted and we will be given a frequency array. The frequency array tells what is the frequency at which we are searching k1, frequency of search of k2, frequency of search of k3 and frequency of search of kn. This frequency means suppose k key1 is searched f1 times in this binary search tree. So we need to construct such a binary search tree such that the overall cost of searching is minimum. For this, you can refer this link. This link is basically GLG link which tells the dynamic programming solution for this. So DP solution is possible for this. So this option is saying optimal binary search tree construction can be performed efficiently using DP. Yes, this is correct. Option C, depth first search cannot be used to find the connected components of a graph. This is false. Let us suppose this is a graph over here. We can have a graph like this, and this, let us suppose this is the entire graph with two connected components. So when we apply DFS on the graph, then DFS will start from this vertex, assume, so it will go to this vertex, this vertex, this vertex, then it will backtrack and will go to this vertex. We will also have a visited array. Let us suppose this is vertex 1, vertex 2, vertex 3, vertex 4, vertex 5, vertex 6, vertex 7. Vertex 1, vertex 2, vertex 3, vertex 4, vertex 5, vertex 6, vertex 7. So when we will visit, we will mark all of them as visited. 1, 2, 3 and 4 has been visited. Now the DFS call stopped. Now again we will check whether there is some non-visited vertex or not. Yes. So again we will call then we will come to know that this was a one connected component. Then again we will make DFS colon 5. So 5 will get visited. then it will visit 6, and then it will visit 7. Then again we will check whether there is some remaining non-visited vertex or not. No one is remaining. So this was connected component 2. So in this manner we can find the number of connected components using DFS. And it is saying it cannot be used. So this is also false. Option D is optimal binary search tree. Given the prefix and postfix was over a binary tree, the binary tree can be uniquely constructed. We can construct a binary tree by the following combinations. We always need an infix expression. Infix and infix can be paired either with prefix or with postfix, which means either we can have infix prefix pair or infix postfix pair. But prefix and postfix is not sufficient for this. So this is false. So we need to tell which all are false. So option A is false, option C is false, option D is false. So answer is option E. This question belongs to database management system and the topic name is indexing. It was asked in GATE CSE 1989. So the question states, for secondary key processing, which of the following file organization is preferred? Give one line justification. Index sequential file organization, two-way linked list organization, inverted file organization, or sequential file organization. So if we have our database, then we have disk blocks. Then how will we store the file? There are various schemes to store the file. Among these schemes, you can remember this order. Like with respect to these four options in terms of efficiency, indexed, sequential, organization has the highest efficiency, followed by inverted organization, followed by two-way linked list, followed by sequential file organization. And this is because we need to do the sorting for sequential file organization, as there will be a file, there may be some parameter, but for sequential organization we first need to sort it, like they may have entry like 10 2 8 5 6. So we first need to sort it so that we can then arrange it sequentially, like 2 5 6 8 9 10, and then we can have sequential direct access. Now according to this efficiency that we have established, either we will use index sequential organization or inverted organization. But we will prefer inverted over the index organization, because because for index organization we will have an index block. An index block will tell which data is present at what place. So it will take more space. And we will be able to save some space if we are using the inverted organization. And also there are some other reasons why inverted is preferred, because we will have an index for each secondary key. For each secondary key we will have an index. That's why inverted is preferred. And an index entry for each distinct value of the secondary key. And for each distinct value we will have an entry. Thus we are preferring inverted file organization for secondary key processing. So the answer is option C.